If you heard my sermon on solitude from a few weeks back, you would have heard me talk about my Lent fast. I have, wherever possible, fasted from all forms of media: TV, music, my phone, the internet. This has been in an attempt to stop listening to the unhelpful noises and voices that shout for our attention, and to create space and silence and solitude in which to hear God's voice more clearly. For the first 3 weeks or so of Lent, this was going very well. I was loving my new regime, enjoying some mental headspace, hearing what God was saying more easily and more frequently. It was making a genuine difference. But then I realised things changed. I haven't broken my fast, and I've continued to use the time created to engage and to listen to God, but it feels as if I've reached a sort of maximum. The initial joy and energy that my fast brought me has reverted to something a bit more mundane. It's as if I've reached a sort of plateau. It's reminded me of something that I read about athletes or anyone that exercises. The danger is that after a while, those training can similarly reach a plateau, an equilibrium, if you like, where the effects of exercise seem to have little or no effect. A few years ago, when we first got the dog, suddenly I found I was increasing my daily step count significantly, as I was now walking an extra hour or even an hour and a half every day. And for the first 6 months, I found that this new level of exercise caused me to lose weight quickly and easily. But then this plateaued. I still walk the dog as much, still achieve the same step count, but now it makes no difference to my weight. Although I suspect that if I suddenly stopped walking the dog, the weight would pile back on. The point is, our bodies adjust to a new normal. I wonder if you have reached a spiritual new normal, a spiritual plateau. Perhaps, like me, your journey through Lent has reached a new normal. Or perhaps, if you're really honest with yourselves, you've reached a new normal in the whole of your spiritual life, not just this season of Lent. Have you settled for the mundane? Have you plateaued? When we read Paul's letters, we see a man who was absolutely adamant that he would never ever allow his spiritual life to plateau. He never settled for a new normal. We see throughout his writings that he is always describing his determination to keep growing, keep going deeper, keep moving further forward. In Corinthians 9, for example, he talks about running. He talks about strict training. He even talks about beating his own body into submission. In his letter to Timothy, we see him talking about fighting the good fight. And we often see Paul talking about standing firm, running, working, training, putting in great labour. And this urging, this encouragement is seen strongly in our passage from Philippians today, where Paul, as usually, describes his own attitude and then encourages us to adopt the same attitude that he has. What's his attitude? He is pressing on. Twice he says this, verse 12 and verse 14. I press on. Paul will not accept a new normal. He will not plateau. He is pressing on. In fact, this is all he is doing. This is his sole focus. Verse 13 begins like this. It says, one thing I do. Now, the original translation of this is simply one thing. One thing. Nothing else. Just one thing. Paul is going to view the past as over and done with. The past is settled. He won't let the past hamper his progress. Instead, he will relentlessly focus his energy on the course that lies ahead, on the race in front of him. Verse 14, he will press on to pursue both the goal and the prize. What's the goal he's pursuing? The goal, as we see in verse 10, is complete knowledge of Christ, both the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. For Paul, the goal is Christ. And the prize? Well, the prize is the award that awaits all Christians, the award of everlasting glory. It's the fullness of blessings. It's the fullness of rewards in the age to come, especially that perfect fellowship that we will be awarded, that perfect fellowship with Christ. Paul knows that this is what he is persistently racing for. Paul knows that this is what he has been called for. Verse 14, he describes it as the prize for which God has called me heavenward. Now, some translations describe this heavenwards as upward calling. In Paul's day, the winner of an athletics race would be summoned or called to approach the judge of the race. The judge would be seated on a raised, elevated stand. And when the winner had gone up to the stand, there the winner would receive the prize. Paul knew that when he had completed his race, he too would be called forward to approach God, the judge of all creation, and there he would receive his prize. Paul's ultimate aspirations are not found in this life, but in heaven, because that is where Christ is, and all Paul ever wants is Christ. Colossians 3, he writes this: since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above where Christ is. Verse 2, set your minds on things above. All Paul wanted was Christ. If I'm honest with you, sometimes, or even often, I feel inadequate next to Paul's total 100% passion for Jesus. I'm not sure I always exhibit quite the same sense of one thing as he did. But I try, and my Lent fast is at least one way in which I can work on it. And I'm not going to sit back and settle for a new normal. I'm not going to sit back and allow my spiritual life, either in Lent or for all of my life, to plateau. I am going to persevere. As I come to a close, one final point. You'd be forgiven to thinking that we're straying into the territory here of salvation by works, that somehow we can earn our salvation, that we must try harder, run faster, train better. Somehow we are persuading God to save us. Simply no. That is not what Paul is talking about. Paul is not advocating justification by works. Our salvation has been won for us, has been achieved for us, has been paid for us by the work of God in Jesus on the cross. We cannot earn our salvation, nor do we have to try. But I do believe we still need to do something. Paul is always encouraging us to be proactive. You see, this is not about earning God's favour. This is about responding to God's grace-filled invitation. This is not about earning God's favour. This is about responding to God's grace-filled invitation. We respond to God's invitation. We respond to God's invitation to keep discovering more of what Christ has won for us. We can never fully understand all that God has done for us. We can certainly never fully understand all that the cross achieved. But God invites us to discover more. He says, come and discover more of what I've got for you. Come and experience more of what this salvation life looks like. And God is also inviting us to play our part. You know, God is always making things new. God is always in the process of making things new. And he invites us to play our part in making all things new. And that includes ourselves. He's always trying to make me new. He's always trying to make you new. And he invites us to train, to run, to persevere, so that we can play our part in making all things new. And that's why it's also God's invitation to the best life. You know, the Bible promises peace. The Bible promises joy. The Bible promises hope. And don't we need hope in this current situation we're going through? But I believe that peace and joy and hope only fully come when we are pursuing, when we are pressing on, when we persevere. In James, we read this, James chapter 1, verse 4, it says, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Don't you want that, to lack nothing? Well, let's persevere. Let's persevere so that we might be mature. Paul says this in 1 Timothy 4. I think this is really helpful. He says, "Train yourself to be godly." Then he goes on to say, verse 8, "For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come." When we persevere, we are taking hold of the promises for this life and the life to come. We are taking hold of God's gift of peace and joy and hope. This, as I said, is for Lent, and it's for the rest of our lives. Can I encourage you, like Paul does, to keep pressing on, to keep persevering, keep responding to God's invitation to discover what salvation life looks like. Keep responding to God's invitation to play our part in making all things new. And keep persevering to take hold of the promise for the best life, both for Lent, for the rest of our lives, and into eternity. Amen.